Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, and Eric, I know it takes a minute for the recordings to process after the meeting. So whenever it does happen and you get the mega file, I'll send you a link to share it with me, and then I'll get it on our YouTube channel and on the site for people who want to, who weren't able to make it today.
Well, I'll just put it on my Google Drive and then send you the link.
Yeah, that works.
Cool.
I've been trying to mess with, YouTube has the ability to make like chapters within a video where you can sort of separate it by defined times. And it's not that easy to do, but I'm trying to separate it so that if people want to look at specific sections like forecasting or funding or whatever, they don't have to watch the whole thing. But see if I can work that out this time around.
Yeah,
so thanks to everybody who's joining. We'll give it another minute or two to let other people who are just logging in get in and then get started. But I guess I can just share my screen. Oh, Eric, can you let me share my screen?
Yes, I will make you a co-host. There we are.
So let's see if this works on the first try. Okay, and I'll see my the PowerPoint.
You got it first try, man.
Nice.
Go buy a lotto ticket.
Nothing else will work, but this worked. So fantastic. Yeah, just another minute or so, and then we'll get started. But thank you for everybody who came to this meeting for our April 2023 CASM Stakeholder meeting. We're gonna spend most of the time today just sort of going over some results and then talking about the program. But you know, it's runoff season, so we're all very busy. I'm speaking for myself, but I know that the ASO folks are just up to it with flights and forecasts and just getting everything coordinated week to week. So big thanks to you guys for sort of mad dash. Sort of like being like a tax accountant. Seems like it's right around the same time. Same mad dash. All right, well, we've got a pretty good group today. As usual with these meetings, we have some slides we'll talk through, but if you have any questions or if anything doesn't make sense, throw it in the chat or raise your hand. You know, we're presenting, but the main goal of this is to educate you all and get some questions back and just make sure that the program is progressing. So in general today, first we want to talk through some flight and data updates. So we have a few people who are willing to talk today. The ASO folks will talk through some of their results and recent flights that have happened. Dave Gotchis, I haven't seen him. Oh yes, he's online and is going to share some updates about WRF Hydro, including sort of data delivery timelines and things like that. And then also Cody Moser from CBRFC is going to talk about how they're using ASO data this year for another round of experimental forecasts, and they've started ingesting that data and producing those. Once we go through the flight and data updates, which should take about an hour, give or take, we'll show kind of the remaining activities for 2023. So there's I'd say we're a little bit less than halfway done with the flights that we need to conduct, but runoff season's just starting. So we're hoping to get kind of an early snapshot of Colorado snowpack, and then there'll be kind of a mid runoff update, but we'll talk through that. And then we also wanted to talk about funding for 2024 and beyond. Every year we're sort of scrapping for funding. And so the earlier we can get this conversation started with anyone who might be offering local match for this, the better. Funding cycles have a tendency to start early and be done early, even though we need the funding in a year. So, so that's where we are. So with that, I'll just kick it off. And Jeff, I think I'll hand it to you. So I'll stop sharing my screen and give it to you to take over. Let me see. Eric, you might have to make Jeff a presenter? I don't know if I can.
Yes, please.
Okay, will do.
All right, so I'll stop sharing my screen.
There you go, Jeff. You should have the ability now.
Got it. All right. All right. I'll echo Paige's thoughts. Thanks everyone for joining today. Pretty busy time of year on all fronts. But glad to give you an update now that we've got a few of the Colorado surveys in hand. And click, there we go. So a summary of where we are so far. We're most of the way through our first round of flights, with most basins having a 2-flight program this year. We got East and Taylor Rivers in the Gunnison on April 1st. We got the Dolores on April 6th, Roaring Fork and Frying Pan, spanning 2 days, the 11th and 12th. And then Blue River, Upper South Platte, and Windy Gap all flown in a single day on the 16th. We had 2 planes in the air that day. And then we're looking for the next weather window to capture the Northern Front Range, Clear Creek up through the Poudre, as well as the Caneos. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. All the data products out so far are, as always, available on our website, data.airbornesnowobservatories.com. We've got all the collected flights are out except for Windy Gap, which should be out within the next hour or so. We're in production on that right now. So go ahead and go find those data if you haven't already. I'll just run through some brief results from each of those flights here and then highlight a few things. So starting with Taylor River, I was out in the Taylor digging a snow pit on the day of the flight and was pleased to see, at least on April 1st, that there was complete snow cover within the basin. Really nice to see no real bare ground except for where it's typically blown clean up there along the divide. But all the way down and around the reservoir was a good deep snowpack. There's some typical patterns that we've been seeing in this basin are reflected this year, with the greater accumulations up in the northwest, kind of Italian basin, Taylor Peak zone, as well as up towards Cottonwood Pass, where the weather seems to funnel up that part of the valley and dump a little more snow up there. And then, of course, the pretty strong wind scouring patterns that we're used to along the Continental Divide, although even though most of that terrain, you could sort of see the ground through it, but still snow covered. The elevation profile of accumulation there on the left, and then elevation aspect bottom left. Interesting to me is a little bit of a double peak in the rose plot there, with the biggest SWE volumes at middle elevation on northeast slopes. Again, probably I guess would reflect that northwestern zone up there, but also a little bit of a peak on the southwestern slopes, and that might be that Cottonwood Pass zone. Anyways, we recorded 207,000 acre feet of SWE in the basin on April 1st. April 1st was before the recent big dust event, which blew in on the 3rd. So at the time of data collection, there was pretty clean snow throughout the watershed. That's reflected in the albedo plots by elevation, showing really pretty bright snow across all the wavelength bands. Next door in the east, pretty similar story to the Taylor. I'll note that the depth scale on the map changes here, because there's a good bit more snow in the east than in the Taylor. That's pretty typical. We've been flying these basins for a number of years now, and there's a pretty consistent longitudinal gradient between the western East River and the Taylor, especially the east side of the Taylor. That's something that also affects avalanche conditions. The local avalanche center divides the zone up into roughly basins that are roughly congruent with these, reflecting different avalanche conditions due to those different snow accumulations. Again, pretty complete snow cover, showing, you know, 1/4 to a 1/2 meter of SWE even on the valley floor. I think that correlates to a 3-wire winter. Deep snow up there in the Rubies and Paradise Divide, typically one of the deeper snowpacks in the state, and no different this year. And again, clean snow in this basin as well on April 1st. 368,000 acre-feet of SWE in the east on April 1st. Moving down to the southwest in the Dolores on April 6th. So in between the 1st and the 6th, we had a pretty gnarly dust event that I'm sure we're all aware of by now. On April 3rd, pretty much hit the whole state, although not in equal amounts everywhere. It was followed by fresh snow. So on April 6th, in the Dolores, as I'll show in a second, it was still pretty bright, but that's the new snow over the dust. On April 6th, again, we're seeing complete snow cover all the way down to town, with a good bit of low elevation SWE. I think we've since seen the melt off of that low elevation SWE begin in earnest, with some local flooding challenges, no doubt exacerbated by the dust emergence. A few hot spots of accumulation. You know, we're used to seeing some deep drifts up in the Lizard Head Pass zone, but some interesting other deep spots up on Black Mesa and down in Bear Creek, as well as the kind of the central range above Rico. You can see the sub-basin distributions here, and there we go. There's the albedo distribution with elevation a little bit darker than the curves from the east and Taylor. So basically, we're seeing mostly the clean snow, but we're starting to be able to see the dust on this date, April 6th, starting to be able to see the dust in areas where it's not buried especially deeply. Solar radiation can penetrate down about a foot deep through new snow. So in areas where it's a foot or less, we can start to see some albedo darkening, even if the surface layer is completely clean. I'm checking the chat here to make sure that, all right, looks like Mo is looking for data. Got that taken care of. Gus asked for what's with the spike in the east at 9,000 feet. Good question. We see that fairly frequently. It's usually some sort of terrain element in various basins. I'd have to dig into what it is in this basin in particular. We also in our reports present SWE depth by elevation as well, which tends to look fairly different than the SWE volume by elevation, and the translator between those two is the terrain hypsography, or the distribution of terrain area by elevation. And so that would be the first thing I would go look to see what that little plateau is there, or that little spike, but I don't have that handy. Okay, moving on to the Roaring Fork and Frying Pan, which we flew in 2 flights, April 11th and 12th. Pretty big gradient from the crest of the Elks in the southwest up towards the Frying Pan. Not too surprising, I guess, given what at least my experience stomping around in these hills, but it was even a greater magnitude than I was expecting in that gradient. In this flight, we really started seeing the effects of the dust, and that's reflected in the albedo curves with elevation, where we're seeing really strong decreases in albedo. A little bit of remnant clean snow at the highest elevations, but even there, we're still starting to see dust through lots of that snowpack. But down in the lower reaches, sub 60%. So that's a really strong influence on the snowpack energy balance, and is leading to pretty rapid snow melt at those lower elevations. I've got a few more images from that Roaring Fork flight. This is the Maroon Bells, of course, 3 meters plus of snow depth in the blues, going down to through yellows and reds for the shallower snow. Zeros here are represented by a lack of color. That's those grays, and where we're seeing the terrain model underneath it. So mostly steep terrain in this image. Stepping back a bit, there's the bells in the distance. The day of this flight, there was an avalanche released in Highland Bowl. That's the terrain feature in the foreground there, and you can see that avalanche reflected by the reds and the bare ground with its deposit down in the blue patch below it. And a number of recent avalanche events are evident in the data, but just kind of brings it down to the human scale there. Looking in Upper Snowmass Creek, this is terrain we've never looked in before. We flew Castle and Maroon Creeks once in 2019 previously, but the rest of the basin we haven't seen the spatial distribution of snow before. So the lower reaches south facing starting to melt out, but still quite a bit of snow up there as we get up towards the higher peaks in Elks. Upper Castle Creek, similar deal, starting to melt out down low. Steve Hunter and I were out in the field down in the bottom center of this image digging a snow pit on this date, and we were expecting quite a bit more snow going in there, but it only turned out to be 70 centimeters deep and rotten, wet depth hoar that we were post holding through on skis. So that dust was really prevalent and having a big impact on that lower elevation snow melt. Sorry, Paige, I just saw your question on the albedos. The typical infrared, broadband, and visible albedo percentage that shows the dust effect, or let me back up to that. There we go.
Yeah, you're showing those plots, like where's the threshold where you can, where you start to see the dust is having an impact.
Yeah, basically, let's go back to the east. These are clean. So typical visible albedos above 90, often 90, 98 or 99% even. And the near IR is down there around 55 to 60. So any decrease from that in the visible is showing the presence of impurities like dust, and decreases in the near infrared and shortwave infrared are typically from snow grain size. So even in a purely clean snowpack, once we get into melt freeze cycles in the spring, we tend to get larger snow grains. That's what makes for corn skiing for those who are fans. Those larger grains absorb more in the infrared. So the presence of dust decreases the visible. It also enhances that melt freeze process. It gets the melt freeze going on earlier than it would otherwise. So a secondary impact is a decrease in the infrared. So here in the Roaring Fork, we're seeing both of those things, really strong dust impacts on the visible, and then where the melt freeze has been going on, some pretty big decreases in the shortwave and near infrared as well. Let's see, one more shot here. This is the Lost Man, Upper Lost Man creeks with you can see part of the Lost Man diversion there in the upper center, Lost Man Reservoir. and then the highway would be going through that valley in the distance there. Lower accumulations in this zone and northward into the frying pan compared to the Elks, but still a good bit of snow up there, and some pretty evident wind redistribution patterns up there. A little more on that dust. Here's a snapshot, also in the report, of an area up in the frying pan showing the true color visible on the left there. Because of those primary impacts in the visible wavelengths, our eyes actually do a pretty good job of telling us where there's dust impact. So quite a lot of it in this case. And then the visible albedo there on the center panel showing some of those strong decreases. We state in the report, and I'll assert again that this level of dust could easily shorten the snow melt season by a month or more, with that enhanced solar radiation absorption and more rapid melt. So even though we're looking at a good bit of snow up there, it's going to come out pretty quick unless we can keep the active weather pattern going and keep that stuff buried. All right, moving on to the Blue River, which we flew on the 16th. These data just came out last night. And as is typical, lots of wind in the 10-mile range showing up here. I was interested in that there's a good bit of accumulation up in the Officers Gulch and Southern Gore Range area up there. I have to go back and see if we've noticed that before, but it popped out to me this time. Kate and I and Taylor and Jay from Denver Water were in the field last week in the blue, and noticed that there was dust around, some of it buried, but not nearly as extreme deposition wise, either in intensity or distribution as over in the Roaring Fork. And I've looked at some MODIS imagery since then. It's definitely having an impact, but it looks to be quite a bit stronger further to the west. And we can see that in the albedo images from the 16th, with pretty bright snow at the upper elevations and starting to get darker down low. Certainly having a strong impact, but again, not nearly to the degree that we've seen over in the Roaring Fork. So we're looking at 175,000 acre feet of water above Lake Dillon as of last weekend. Also released last night was the Upper South Platte. It's the first time we've flown this basin. Flew at the same time as the Blue. 108,000 acre feet measured in this domain, with the sub-basin breakdowns shown there. Pretty high snow line, and I think that's been, just observationally been the case all winter. I remember driving 285 a month and a half ago or so and remarking about how high the snow line was even then. It'll be no surprise to anyone who's spent any time in South Park that the snow accumulation there is strongly wind driven. And we see that reflected at all elevations in this data set. Pretty interesting kind of sharp spike in the elevation profile with the SWE volume, reflecting both that the lack of snow at lower elevations and a pretty quick drop off up into the wind scoured alpine. I have not gone and looked for dust in this basin personally, but from looking at the satellite, I'd say it looks pretty similar to what we saw over in the Blue, where it's definitely there, but not quite as extreme as areas to the west. The albedo data from ASO would suggest that maybe it is a little darker from the dust in the South Platte than it is over in the Blue. That may just reflect that there wasn't as much new snow on top of it at those low elevations as over in the Blue, but hard to say. Okay, a couple other analyses here that I think are interesting. I've looked at the the East River and the Taylor, comparing the amount of the SWE map from this year's flight on April 1st to the April flight data from 2019, which is our most recent large snow accumulation year, and therefore sticking in many folks' minds as a comparable year to maybe compare to this year. So in the East River, nearly identical snowtail SWE on the two snowtails there, Butte and Schofield passed, effectively identical in those 2 years. The dates were April 1st this year and April 7th in 2019. The computed basin SWE volume in each of those was 349,000 acre feet this year and 368 in 2019. So about 20,000 acre feet of difference, despite the snowtails being in close agreement there. But really interesting to me is this pretty big difference in spatial patterns. So the color ramp here goes from plus to minus half a meter of water equivalent from blue to red. Some of the pattern we're seeing here really speaks mostly to the major avalanche cycle that had occurred in 2019. On the kind of northwest of the basin here, you can see the dark blue areas. Those are all avalanche start zones that were largely shallow snow in 2019 after the avalanche cycle, and that currently have quite a bit of snow in them. So the difference, that pattern difference, is largely avalanche driven. There's some of that in the north and east as well. As we get over into the northeast, there's some changes in where the snow drifts are. And that's that kind of fine-scaled stipply pattern. On the broader scale, though, there's a good bit more snow at the lowest elevations down in the valleys this year, and there was a good bit more snow in the mid-elevation forests in 2019. So pretty interesting to compare the difference in those 2 years in a couple different ways to look at it here. Similar story over the hill in the Taylor. In this case, the snowtails from in the upper Taylor and Park Cone were showing a pretty different amount with looks like about 16 inches this year and upwards of 17 and a half inches in 2019. Interestingly, again, April 1st and April 7th in the 2 years, showing exactly the same amount of SWE volume on those dates in this basin. And then the difference in spatial pattern is similar to, although maybe slightly lower in magnitude than over in the east, with more snow on the valley floors this year, more snow on the slopes in 2019, and then some wind and avalanche differences at finer scales. So interesting to try to compare, at least in these basins, the kind of most recent big year that we're all sort of leaning on to think about what comes next. Speaking of coming next, looking to finish out our current round of flights as soon as we get a next weather window. That'd be the Northern Front Range and Conejos. Currently looking pretty stormy for the next 10 days, which is a little bit astonishing and a little frustrating to get those flights in. On the other hand, if it keeps bringing snow to cover up the dust, I'm not going to complain too much. Would like to keep that snow nice and bright. So we'll get those flights in as soon as we have a weather window to do so. Looking at the second round of flights, our original timing here, and this is something that is in regular discussion on our weekly flight planning meetings or flight coordination calls, but kind of looking into late May to start those second flights up. Of course, we're always thinking about flight weather being the ultimate arbiter there. I guess we've hit peak SWE, so that's going to drop off the schedule factor list there. And then we start looking for things like peak flow timing, or as the snowtails start melting out, to decide when the best time to do those second flights is. That's all I have for today. Happy to take any further questions or open it up for discussion.
I got a question, Jeff. This is Noah.
Yeah.
Isn't just curiosity, well, not just curiosity, but related to the pace of snow melt and the dust, with a little bit of new snow burying it. I mean, isn't it inevitable that the dust will be at the surface at some point? So, like, how does a little bit of any amount of fresh snow, I mean, it solves the problem, the immediate problem, in that it will slow down melt, but eventually that dust is going to be at the surface, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we're getting regular accumulations every couple days for the next 10 days, and therefore, if it's snowing, maybe less sun coming in at the same time, just delaying things a little bit. But you're right. I mean, the fate is sealed. That strong dust layer will be on the surface pretty quickly, and unless we bury it by like 2 feet, even a foot of snow is going to cook down and the dust will start seeing the sunlight, and it'll be back out before long. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful.
Hey, Jeff, this is Josh here. I was really interested to see the 2019 to 2013 comparison there, and especially some of the discrepancies between the SNOTEL readings in, what was it, the Taylor, as opposed to the basin-wide SWE measurements as captured by you all. And I think, I mean, to me, this is an instance where it like begs the question of like, okay, how does this translate into our water supply forecasts? It would be a really a great opportunity to do some hindcast modeling in the basin and to begin to parse out the information that this ASO SWE data set provides to, of course, the runoff models. So really cool to see that. And I think this sort of analysis I'd be really interested in seeing in the reports that are coming out. I feel like that was something that has been missing, of this baseline comparison to past years, especially now that we accumulate more years of data. And so going forward, maybe it's something to consider for your team.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think the key perspective here is that these are basin SWE volumes. Your question is astute. How does that translate to runoff? We'll hand it off here to Dave Gotchis to start talking about some modeling on that front. So I think the key perspective here is that this is an integrated data set. We use the SNOTEL SWE in depth to help constrain our SWE retrieval. And the combination of the two really gives us that temporal and spatial perspective. So any modeling builds on top of both of those data sets. It is interesting to see the same amount of SWE with slightly different readings on the pillows, although I don't think that shouldn't surprise anyone at this point. We can get different snow accumulation patterns and end up with different or the same amount on the pillows. And really, I think that thinking of the two data sets in combination really helps us build out both the temporal and the spatial component here. But I agree it's pretty interesting story. It's not well, I just say I think it adds to the richness of our understanding of both the snowpack and eventually the basin plumbing in these watersheds.
With that, so Jeff, that was perfectly timed. You got right to 1:30 for half an hour section. So Eric, can you make Dave Gotchis a presenter? Dave, I see you on here. I assume you're ready to talk. So yeah, if Eric can give you access, then go for it.
Dave, you should be good to go.
I believe so. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll go into full mode. Yeah, well, yeah, apt question and reply from Jeff there. We do have a state domain for Wharf Hydro now up and running. And as I'll mention later, we've pivoted from what we originally proposed to do to go into a weekly cadence to better sync up with the available flight information, but I'll talk about that at the end. So we've done 2 different forecast runs, is what that basically means, of WRF Hydro, where we are simulating in the various ASO flights. To date, we have forecast runs that incorporated the East and Taylor into those domains, and then most recently the Dolores into its domain. And then the next 4 basins, some of which that are 4 basins, some of which that Jeff just covered. We're just getting those now. We just got some of them last night, and I think Jeff said Windy Gap's still coming. That will be in next week's forecast run of WRF Hydro. So again, we're batching things up and pushing them through in that manner. Just looking at the expanded domain here, of course, we had a very significant increase over what was done last year. And even this map, we still don't have all of our basin polygons sort of delineated here for the Front Range basins, at least in our display tool here. So again, a few bit more that's coming. The model domain, of course, here is in the upper right-hand corner. So, we're encapsulating all of these areas, but of course, the bulk of the focus of the work is on the ASO assimilated basins and translating those into forecasts, updated forecasts as soon as possible. So we'll go over the results that we have to date. Like I said, that includes the forecasts, 2 runs now for the Taylor and East River. One right after we got those surveys, and then one that was in conjunction with this week's execution of the model, which has the ASO data from the prior time assimilated into it, and then our most recent Dolores River forecast run. So here's the Taylor Basin we're starting to look at. There's a SWE accumulation plot up to the time of the first survey and some designation of what the ASO value was, what our open loop model was doing at that time. The yellow line in that time series plot up on the right-hand side is the SNODAS analysis for the Taylor River Basin. The spatial maps you're looking at down below do include the Taylor, the East, and the Roaring Fork. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the shapes of these basins by now. So you can see there prior to assimilation what the survey looked like, or what the analysis of SWE looked like. The color scale here is roughly 0 to 40. The decimals are because of a metric conversion, so disregard that. And then you can see the after assimilation in the next middle frame there. And for both of these basins, well, the Taylor was not a massive increment due to the assimilation, but a pretty significant repatterning of the SWE in the basin, particularly on some of the extremities of the basin, tapering off some of the overestimates that happened up in the upper Taylor branch, and then really correcting some of the underestimates that were going on. It looked like up in the what is the Texas Creek branch, but where Cottonwood Pass is in that basin. And Jeff mentioned that appears to be an area that tends to have quite a bit of funneling of precipitation and snowpack accumulation going on. Looking ahead to where we launched this forecast our most recent forecast, which was on the 13th, so a few days ago, you could see some pretty widespread reduction compared to the SWE analysis on 4.2 on April 2nd. A lot of that is just sort of local reductions in values. We haven't seen a massive pullback in snow-covered area in the analysis yet. In this particular region, being a pretty high elevation region, although there are certainly some areas which do have some reductions going on. Looking at comparison of the snowpack in the model with SNOTEL, this is from April 13th when we ran our last iteration. You can see the color scale down here on the bottom. The dots that are indicating the comparison plots are showing some fairly good agreement across the region. There is a few locations where we do have some more significant underestimates in the model. Schofield Pass, right at the headwaters of the East River Basin, is a notable one. It's an area that definitely is often quite a bit greater than the model, tends to catch a lot of snow. But for the Upper Taylor site, for the Crested Butte SNOTEL site, for the St. Elmo site, just over the divide on the Arkansas side, and for the Park Cone site, things appear to be performing pretty well in the model as it's tracked since the last ASO survey got in. Elevational distributions is something we're also adding to our analysis this year so that we can compare background model performance and the impact of the ASO data coming in. This is for the Taylor River Basin. The overall elevational profile, you can see there between the blue and the green is somewhat similar, but I think as Jeff just covered, sort of the massive diversity or range and values you get from the ASO data at the highest elevations, in particular up above tree line, so really anything above about 11.5. Here, you can really start to see a much broadening, a very significant broadening of the local SWE values. These are not aerially weighted for volume, so these are just local pixel values of snow water equivalent here. You can see that Snowdass was appearing to underestimate some of that higher elevation SWE. That might just be an artifact of, you know, when they assimilated their snow-covered area into the model and some of the adjustments that they go through for that assimilation. I don't really know, but it's just an interesting departure there. Okay, so Taylor Basin inflow forecast. So this is for the entirety of the Taylor Basin into Taylor Park Reservoir. As I'll show in a little bit, we do have flow forecasts for the individual main tributaries, which is Taylor River, Texas Creek, and Willow Creek going on now. You can see there's two different forecasts here, and we have sort of the April through July and the April through September numbers that are calculated here. And then I just put a plot up, for example, which most folks who've been tracking our work with Wharf Hydro saw the forecast last year to CASM. These kind of plots should be familiar. So the beginning of April forecast, right after the ASO survey, we were coming in at about 124,000 acre feet. For the April through July number, that bumps up to about 137,000 acre feet for the April through September period. Those are both median forecasts. You can see in the plot to the right, there are other exceedance levels that are published with these. Looking at the flow forecast from the 13th, so just about 2 weeks later, and this was after sort of a very anomalously warm, dry, and a somewhat windy period here in Colorado. Oh, you guys are all in Colorado, sorry, forget sometimes. You can see that the forecasts have dropped by about 8 to 9%, give or take, on the level. So the April through July number for Taylor Reservoir inflow had dropped down to 113, and the April through September number had dropped down to about 125,000 acre feet. As I mentioned again, you can see in the upper right-hand corner the spatial map and the three different, now each of these are gauged tributaries into Taylor Reservoir by the USGS. So about I believe it's 2 years ago, the USGS installed gauges on Texas Creek and Willow Creek. And it's been really nice to have those as validation points. And now we're going to be, as the rating curves have settled out for those gauges, we're able to do a much more validation at those sites. So we'll be tracking this as time goes on. Texas Creek and Willow Creek are quite a bit smaller than the Taylor branch from this, but as Jeff just said, there's such diversity in where the snow is piling up in the basin. It's nice to be able to validate that in a spatially distributed context. And Wharf Hydro being a spatially distributed model, we really like to have that extra spatial information coming in. Soil moisture in the area, a little spatial map on the bottom. Values range from sort of yellow for near zero up to a value of 1.0 for the dark blue. Things are just starting to wet up. The time series plot you see behind there runs from October 1st, and sort of the long flat period, of course, is when the basin soils are under snowpack. And so you can see there at the very end, really within the last 2.5 weeks, soil moisture values have really started to ramp up as we've started to see some melt. Now, most of that's probably coming from the lower elevation areas in the basin, of course, but we'll expect that to continue to climb upward. Moving over to the east, I'll go a little faster now. Sorry, was there a question? Nope. Okay. I'll go a little faster now that sort of I'm going to use the same plot orientation. For the East River Basin, the ASO survey, as Jeff said, came in at 368. Our open loop was at 333. Snowdass in this basin was quite a bit higher, up at 453. And definitely not picking on Snowdass. I will just say that getting reliable meteorological forcings across the state of Colorado this year has been a challenge. And so there are times that we have big increments as well between what ASO is seeing and what our open loop model is doing, because the open loop is relying on strictly the meteorological data. And again, there are some big departures in places. You can see the before and after assimilation. Those are basically the same plots I just showed, since the east and the Taylor really are right next to each other. So nothing really new to look at in the spatial plots. Elevation distribution. This says Ohio Basin. It's not. It's actually the East River Basin. You can see how those are performing here. ASO is a little bit better matched in its elevation profile with SNODAS, and then our open loop model is really overestimating snowpack at a higher elevation there. Looking at the flow forecast for the East River at Almont, this is just one of about 7 locations within the basin where forecasts are being extracted. You can see very similar to the Taylor Basin. There's been some reductions since the early April forecast and the mid-April forecast. For the April through July period, we went from 326,000 acre feet down to 304. And then for the April-September period, we went from 385 down to about 361,000 acre feet. So that warm, windy period was pretty widespread, did eat a little bit of snow. And of course, we didn't get a whole lot of new snow during that period. I've been looking at local hydrographs just sort of in real time now, and things have definitely started to ramp back down in terms of stream flow values as we've cooled off and gotten our recent weather here. Similar story for soil moisture in the East River Basin. Moving on to the Dolores, you can see the same setup here prior to assimilation and then after assimilation, and then the current value. And really the main story here is that ASO added quite a bit of snow to the basin compared to our background value. You can see a lot sort of heavier values, more widespread across the basin. There is obviously a lot more variability in the ASO survey, which came over between the 6th and the 7th there. And those patterns have pretty much persisted with a little bit of reduction in the region all the way up to our April 13th forecast initialization period. You can see the adjoining basins there for things like the San Miguel, the Uncompahgre, the Animas, and the headwaters of the Rio. So those are being tracked as well, but we don't have any flight information for those. Comparison against SNOTEL site, again, a little bit more evidence of some underestimation in our open loop model going on in this area. So we saw that bear out in the increment that came over with ASO. So that does appear to be correcting an underestimate from what we would have gotten without ASO in this particular area. That does extend into the Dolores, but you see it also over to the east towards the Rio. Elevational profiles, again, just can look at some inner comparisons of those. Getting into the flow values then, starting to wrap up here, I just have 413, April 13th forecast here. So I'm showing 2 different locations. This is the Dolores River at Dolores. So for the April through July period, that was 446,000 acre feet. Using that peak snowpack estimate coming from ASO was a runoff ratio of about 0.77 for that period. If we use the same SWE value and look at the April through September period, the flow goes up to about 472,000 acre feet, and the runoff ratio jumps up to about 0.82. Those seem like pretty reasonable numbers for this region and these headwater areas. So I think we feel reasonably confident that these new values we got with the ASO snowpack are doing quite a bit, having quite a bit of benefit in that regard. Go upstream to Rico, Colorado, further up in the headwaters, the values drop, but the overall pattern is largely the same. 113,000 acre feet from April through July and 121,000 acre feet through September. A lot more stream flow locations being modeled. We've shown those in the past. So folks interested, feel free to reach out. We'll try to tuck some of these into the reports that we're pulling together. And
real quick,
yes.
Yeah, you got a question in the chat from DK. What is the source of the runoff ratio data, and can you speak more to that?
Yeah, DK. So we're just taking what we're estimating as the peak SWE value that we're getting, or near peak SWE value. So this would be the value in the Dolores this time that's coming from the ASO survey. So we're assuming that that is something representative of peak. So we're aggregating the whole basin integrated SWE value from that above the Dolores gauge here. And then we're taking those two different periods of accumulated runoff and dividing it by the peak SWE to get those runoff ratios. I think that's about it. We've just started compiling the SWE estimates from those new surveys that Jeff just talked about. These are just comparative, just our open loop versus the ASO surveyed value, just to see how the model was tracking. Again, we tended to have a bit of an underestimate in the open loop model across this region for these particular areas. We don't have the Windy Gap survey yet. We're updating our polygon for the Roaring Fork to include the frying pan part since that survey came over. So I don't have a comparison for you there. These are the same numbers I just summarized for the Dolores, Taylor, and East River. So this is just giving us a quick comparison between what the model would have said without the ASO data, now what is coming in with the ASO data. It does appear that the peak SWE values would have occurred sometime around that first-ish week of April. Of course, that's weather dependent. We could see something happen, but there was that pretty steep decline in some of those areas. So we think we're probably past peak for at least a lot of these more southerly basins, but of course, time will tell. That is about it. As I mentioned at the top of this section, we have moved to weekly forecasts just to better accommodate the cadence of ASO surveys. We'll just go ahead and keep to that, even if we enter a stormy period and we don't get a number of different new surveys, say in the next week or so. It's just good to have that. And of course, there's a couple days lag from when we get the surveys from when we can actually do the forecast. So I didn't have all those new basins forecasts ready. Include, as Jeff said, the Blue Dillon, Windy Gap, South Platte, and Roaring Fork frying pan systems. And I think that is about it. So I'll go ahead and stop and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, so that Gus has a question in the chat of where these forecasts get posted. And I know we've been sort of going back and forth about like the right way to deliver these by email. Dave, I know you had talked about delivering sort of a PDF of the results. Is that the plan currently?
That is the plan. I think and it's worked well for California so far this year. The main difference, though, is in California, we're forecasting for 5 basins. So it's not too much to pull together, a PDF report for that. Colorado, we have a ton more. So it's a bit of a different beast to figure out what's the most efficient way to really serve what ends up being better part of 70 or 80 different forecast points on such a frequent cadence. So, for our own internal purposes, we do use our Hydro Inspector display tool. We also have started compiling just sort of archives of those runoff plots that you guys have seen, the accumulated runoff plots on a Google Drive site. But it does include a bunch of different experimental locations. So it might be worth a call between sort of the CASM planning team about, what's the sort of final official things that we want to distribute versus, we had that list going of around 200 or so different forecast points earlier, some of which are clearly more experimental and investigative than what we'd consider to be, more reliable guidance to put out to the community. Right. I don't want to put anything out that's not that we have sort of low faith in, or certainly things that aren't really involved in an ASO assessment, since that's what this program's about. So I think it's worth a bit more discussion. And I would just say if people have specific forecast points that they're interested, please reach out and we can get those to people very quickly. But it's kind of the service of the larger batch of data. I think we need a little more discussion on. I think there was another question that popped up while I was talking there. Noah. Oh, yeah. In those SWE plots, it really ranges, the SWE evaluation plots, it does range. The very sort of lightly tinted, a white value in those plots was really, about plus or minus 10%. And then the outer ranges went quite a bit larger in terms of percent. So, you know, when I went and looked around, say the values in the Taylor and the East basins, we were getting some values which were around 5 or 6% all the way up to around local differences with snowtail sites of 30 to 40%. There's a lot of variability at snowtail sites, so I tend to put more faith in some of the, in terms of the volume estimates of SWE in the basin aggregated comparisons, say between ASO surveys as a representation of truth, and Jeff has already talked about how those get matched with snowtail data. You know, our basin aggregates, and then also the Snowdass basin aggregates. I think you know, we can look at patterns. I trust the patterns more than I do the absolute values of the errors, say when I go from a 1 kilometer grid model to a point. So that's, you know, that's what I would say. But you didn't see any of those really saturated colors on the end. So, you know, those percentages were kind of in the tens for most of the sites that was being plotted there. I hope that helps. DK albedo data incorporated into Wharf Hydro. Not explicitly new albedo information at this time. Ronnie Abalafia Rosenzweig from our group here did have a paper published last year about some updated regional calibrations to our albedo decay function in the Wharf Hydro snow model that we're using here. It comes from the NOAA land surface model. And so that has resulted in a sort of a broader range of snow albedo decay after a fresh snow event in it, but it doesn't have the explicit dusk accounting that Jeff mentioned. So that's still sort of something that's out there. There are a couple of different funded efforts right now to look at different ways to do that, mostly from the state of California, but they're not in our real-time operational system right now.
Dave, just thinking a little bit about data delivery. Obviously, like you point out, there's a lot of nuance to which forecast locations you want to deliver. But if you were developing, you know, even a simple PDF for each of these for your sort of regular forecast cadence, if you had a central place where you could post those, and then we could share that link out with the group, and then, you know, when there is an update, we can sort of remind people of that. I think that would be really helpful, rather than sort of, you know, a game of email telephone, because I think what you're producing is one of the more critical parts of this whole program, which is kind of like where the rubber meets the road in terms of stream flow. So if there was a way that you could put these on a Google Drive that you'd be willing to share publicly with the stakeholder group, you know, you could make it read only so people could just download, but not, you know, flood you with data.
Not going and change them. No, yeah,
Right.
no, I agree.
Exactly.
Let's just discuss what those points are, and we can do that for sure.
Okay.
Gus, yeah, I think that's a good start, actually. Those major forecast points that are already being covered is a good start.
Well, we'll definitely, if you have any questions, anything that comes to mind for anybody else on the call a little bit later, feel free to chime in or reach out directly. But Dave, thank you for that overview. And let's try to, if possible, even just by email, let's try to settle the forecast delivery stuff soon, just because you're starting to produce them now, and it'd be good to know, it'd be good to point people to that
Yep,
in the near
sounds
term.
good.
And so I think next, I think he's still on here. So Cody Mosier from CBRFC was going to present some results on the experimental forecasts, ingesting ASO into CBRFC's forecast system. So I think, Eric, if you want to make Cody a presenter, and Cody, if you're here and not just eating your lunch, I think you can show your slides.
Thanks, Paige. Can you see my slides okay and hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, thanks. Yeah, just gonna quickly go over some of the work we've been doing, ingesting ASO data into our modeling system and producing some experimental water supply forecasts with that data. Gonna show results from the Gunnison, Dolores, and Roaring Fork today. So what we're doing is we're converting the 50-meter gridded SWE data set that ASO provides. We're converting that 50-meter grid to a mean aerial SWE value for each area in our model. And then we're replacing our model SWE with that value and running it through our ESP in an offline version of the model. So just showing an example here. This is from the Roaring Fork flight. Looking at the Roaring Fork Aspen Basin within our model, just the snow plot there with the zone above 11,000 feet and below 11,000 feet. So in this case, adding about an inch above 11,000 and removing about an inch below 11,000 is what we saw there. And then, so we do that, and then we run those new snow states through our ESP model framework, which uses 1991 through 2020 map forcings and outputs 30 different hydrographs. And then we take those 30 different hydrographs, produce a probabilistic forecast, and then the product, experimental forecast product here on the right, with some information explaining hopefully pretty clearly what it is, what it isn't, a graphic, and some values in a table at the bottom of the forecast product. So this here, this was the flight April 1st at Taylor Park Reservoir. The graphic's a little hard to see, but you can see our forecasts here since the 1st of January, how it's evolved. And then the cyan bar here, that would be the experimental forecast. In this case, it was done on the same day as we issued an official forecast. So it's overlain right on top of the official forecast. So in this particular case, ASO experimental forecast, about 12,000 acre feet lower than our April 1st official forecast. Sticking with the Gunnison flight on April 1st, this is east at Almont. ASO SWE in place of our model SWE, again suggesting lower volume runoff, in this case about 15,000 acre feet. I'm looking at the ESP 50, which I think we're all aware. So the volume that has a 50% chance of being exceeded or not being exceeded. So that's east at Almont. Here we're in the Dolores on the April 6th flight. In this basin, ASO SWE suggesting a higher runoff volume, higher SWE, leading to a higher volume forecast. So 387 was our model guidance on the 6th, and then 428,000 acre feet using ASO SWE in our model above Dolores at Dolores. And then onto the Roaring Fork here. This is the Rudai Reservoir inflow forecast. Let's see. So ASO here suggesting about a little more SWE. It would be about a 10,000 acre foot increase in volume compared to our ESP model guidance on that day. Sticking with the Roaring Fork, this is downstream at Glenwood Springs. So kind of an interesting case here. So this would include the frying pan down to Rudai plus Aspen and Hunter Creek basins in our model, and those had 100% flight coverage. We also model Roaring Fork at Emma, and in that basin, in our zone above 11,000 feet, we had 89% flight coverage, and then the 9,500 to 11,000 foot zone, 76% flight coverage. So this graphic excludes the Emma basin. ASO SWE substitution includes Aspen and Hunter Creek, and then the Rudai stuff. Pretty similar results there compared to our ESP model guidance on that day. So we have a framework now for producing these experimental forecasts using ASO data with our goal is just being transparency and becoming more familiar with the data. Always seeking to improve our modeling. Basins with more flights give us a larger sample size to work with, and then basins that are less well gauged, we support those flights as well. A good example was in the Upper Green last year, where results suggested some improved forecast verification up there using ASO data. And yeah, I mean, anything from just advancements in the weather forecast modeling in the last just 10 years or so to trying to account for, you know, dust and different SWE data sets out there. A little bit time constrained this season with all the water that's out there, getting some new forecasters in our rotation, and yeah, really wasn't expecting to see that 100,000 CFS down on the Verde last month, down in Arizona. And then, yeah, just continuing to refine our framework, further investigation and verification work. That's all I had. Take any questions.
There's a post from Steve Hunter in the chat.
Steve, no, it's not available on our website. I know last year I think we did the email route with the CASM team, but am open to taking any requests back to my team and seeing what we can do.
And Cody, actually on that, are you okay with us posting, I mean, obviously this video will be posted, but if you had any slides that you would be willing to share, we can host these on the CASM site as just sort of part of that program, but recognizing that these aren't, you know, an official CBRFC product.
Yeah, let me get back to you on that after I chat with some of my folks.
Also, Lauren in the chat asks, is there a reason the letter T is being used to show thousands of acre feet instead of K? Because we're not talking about trillions of acre feet. So fair enough. Lauren, we can all hope. Yeah, definitely some difference in naming conventions, TAF versus KAF. A couple hands raised though. Jeff, you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to express some gratitude to Cody and the RFC team for digging into this. Definitely extra work for you guys during a busy time of year. So I just want to say thanks a bunch for pursuing this effort.
And then Gus, your hand's up too.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Cody. Question specifically about the Roaring Fork experimental forecasts, and maybe this was in some of the others too. I'm just noticing the distance between like the 50 and the 30 is really, really tight. And I'm wondering if there is an obvious reason for that. I think it was the Roaring Fork one, not the Rudai. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of a artifact, I don't know if that's the right word, with the ESP processes. As you get later into the season, you get less spread in your future weather possibilities. So you start to see some funky things going on with the probabilistic information and the traces that can cause that. We've been aware of it, trying to work through some ideas to looking at reforecast data to just try to get a better handle on representing a more realistic spread with some of these probabilistic volumes. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, Cody, again, thank you so much for this. And actually, we'll talk a little bit more about the sort of another benefit of these forecasts in a sec here. But we'll save this and feel free to talk within the CBRFC about, at what level you all are comfortable sharing this with, even if it's just some of these plots and not the sort of added discussion. But whatever you can share, we'd be happy to host and share broadly, especially as we continue to sort of promote this program and start taking this Colorado-wide ASO program and getting it to be a more integrated with regular forecast operations. The hope one day being that this is kind of a regular thing that always that's just kind of a reliable data source that's part of Colorado's snowpack monitoring. With that, Cody, if you want to stop sharing, I'm going to take over again and just sort of wrap up the meeting, or not wrap up, but talk about a couple other small things. Let's see if this is just going to work quickly again. All right, am I sharing my screen again?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of these things. Jeff brought up a lot of details about the timing of flights and sort of what's happened in the season so far. And I just kind of wanted to bring this back and give a big picture of what has happened in 2023 and what remains for the rest of the year. So blue are all the basins where we're planning on having flights and forecasts produced. Many of them have already had a first round and some will in the future. The Front Range is kind of the most notable sort of multi-stakeholder example that we're waiting on in the next couple of weeks here. The table at the bottom left shows just generally which surveys have been done and the approximate timeline of the upcoming surveys. Obviously, all the data products haven't been produced for all of the surveys, but just in general, with about 2 flights per basin, this is about the timing we can expect. So by the end of April and definitely by the end of May, we'll have all of these forecasts produced for the year, but we'll stay busy and get these shared out either by the stakeholder list or by email. We're going to try to be as efficient as we can about it. Just a general reminder on approximate data delivery timelines. So on a weekly basis, I guess I'll talk about this first. On a weekly basis, on Mondays from 2 to 3 p.m., Eric Sky from the CWCB is hosting flight coordination calls. So if you are a stakeholder that wants that has specific opinions about where these flights should be happening and when, specifically when, because the where has been well defined. Those calls are Monday mornings or Monday afternoons. Reach out to Eric if you have any questions about those or if you want to be added to the list. They're fairly quick at this point. I think most of the criteria and kind of desired flight timing has been well established now, but we just have a quick call about those every week. And then after each flight, this is the approximate timeline. Obviously, this is flexible depending on many things, but the approximate timeline of delivery of the different products. So 2 to 3 days after a flight is typically when the ASO reports come out, followed maybe a day after that. So 3 to 4 days post-flight for the ice snowbell detailed modeling report. And then around 5 to 6 days after the flight is about when the WRF hydro forecast results could be available, though, as Dave pointed out, he's trying to shoot for a weekly cadence of these. And yeah, Eric just put his email in the chat. And yeah, so reach out to him if you feel like you should have been on these flight planning coordination calls. We don't really talk about results in those. Those are primarily just a way to coordinate the weather and aircraft availability with the flights we want to conduct. So don't feel like you're missing too much if you don't attend those, but if you feel like you should be there, you're welcome. So moving on. So this group is a never-ending conversation about funding. I feel like that is perpetually the conversation we have, with the small exception of the time of year where we get to actually get some cool data and some forecast results. So we just wanted to get everybody to start thinking about funding for 2024. We're starting to prepare for next year. Both the CWCB is working towards getting a significant amount of funding for this program. I'll talk about a reclamation grant opportunity that's out there that some different CASM stakeholders are pursuing. But I think local match is something that's going to be a reality of this program for the foreseeable future, both in terms of we just need the money, and also because the more kind of local buy-in there is, the more the CWCB kind of sees the value of the program, as well as other funding agencies. So all that is to say, if this is something that you have funded in the past or are considering funding in the future, know that we know that many budget cycles are coming up, and please look into what you might have available to support this program. We definitely have we have a lot of numbers already for how much funding we will probably need for the coming years. But reach out to us if you are able to make commitments. And we've had several groups make significant commitments in the last few months for future years. So it's really great to see the sort of combination of state, local, and hopefully federal funding to support this program. Just to give you some context of where we could potentially have flights in 2024, the map on the right shows these what we're calling shovel-ready basins, or ones that don't need any updates to their snow-free data to be flown. There are other basins, including the Eagle River and Rio Grande headwaters, that either have existing snow-free data that need to be recollected because it's insufficient for surveys now, or areas that we would target for additional snow-free data development. There is a much more detailed map that shows lots and lots of areas that we'd like snow-free data collection for, but we haven't finalized what snow-free data we will collect. All this is to say, there's a lot of area we could fly next year. And if any of these basins are relevant to you, and we can help get you data to improve your decision-making, please consider helping fund this program, and reach out to me, Eric, the ASO folks, if you have specific things you want to talk about. And then I just wanted to give a quick nod to this reclamation grant opportunity that was released a few weeks ago. In general, this follows on an emerging technologies in snow report to Congress that was published in November 2021. There's a snow water supply forecasting program grant that several state CASM stakeholder agencies are planning to apply to. And the CASM group generally is willing to support those applications with cost estimates for their program, some matching funding from the CWCB, as well as some text background on, what the technology is, what kind of results they come out of it, and just generally the nuts and bolts of what these surveys entail. So if you don't already know about this and you're interested in submitting an application to sort of further this program, please reach out. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, and this is probably the first major step towards some sort of federal funding for the CASM program. So we're pretty excited about the different groups that are putting in these applications. To be clear, CASM is not actually putting in an application because we are not technically a legal entity. We're a scrappy group of volunteers that just are very interested in the subject. But many different stakeholder agencies are sort of considering applying so that they can get flights over their area. And CASM is just helping align the goals of those different flights and the program in general.
Paige, real quick on that,
Yeah.
on that note, I'll note that this grant opportunity came out of some federal legislation that was sponsored by the California delegation, or put forward by the California delegation, Senators Feinstein and Harris, but with local co-sponsorship from several of our Colorado reps. So we owe a debt of thanks to our federal legislators for pushing this forward. It was passed as a part of the omnibus bill in 2020 and funded thereafter. And I'll note that it actually said Airborne Snow Observatory in the bill text. So that was a bit of a milestone. And there's already further attention being paid at the federal level to expanding the program, either this specific reclamation type program or otherwise. So stay tuned for that in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I do like to point out that Emerging Technologies in Snow report to Congress did actually call out the CASM group as like this group that was trying to coordinate ASO flights. So it's kind of cool to get our group called out in a big federal document like that. So this sort of wraps up the content that we had for the stakeholder meeting today. And just wanted to say thank you. We have these meetings on a monthly basis. There will probably be another similar presentation for the May meeting, which will focus more on late season results. We typically focus on the forecast results and the snowpack measurements during the runoff season, and then we can get into things like sort of more specific use cases and other program background in the stakeholder meetings outside of that. So expect to see a message about this in the weeks to come. Generally, we're trying to post every 2 weeks or so some program updates to our website, coloradosnow.org. If you see anything on there that you have questions about, or if you just want to read more about what we're trying to do, go there. And just a big, so Lauren pointed out in the chat that there's still basins that you need someone to help with apply for that grant. Aurora can help with matching funds. Lauren, we'll talk offline, but yes, I think we will be. I think we will lean on you for that. And I just wanted to give a thanks to the CASM planning team. I mean, we meet at least once, if not multiple times a week, and have been trying to get this beast of an airplane off the ground for the last few years. And I think we're, every year we're a little more efficient about it. And I think hopefully we're producing some, we're starting to lay the foundations for some excellent snow science in the long term for Colorado. So thank you for everybody who comes to those meetings, and thank you all for coming today.
Thanks, Paige.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Thank you, guys. Great job.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Paige, and just want to echo your comments on thanking everyone for your time today. Really happy to see this big interest in the CASM group.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
See you later.